You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Brook-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. We're now about to enter our usual winter break, celebrating the solstice, Christmas, and New Year, as well as getting some time to rest and restore, ready for what looks to be a wild and magical 2021. We wish you a beautiful, soulful couple of weeks too, and we'll be back in your ears on the 5th of January. And now, on to this week's show. I spoke to Chris Mackey about the glorious topic of synchronicity, one of my favourites. Chris is a clinical and counselling psychologist and fellow of the Australian Psychological Society with 40 years psychotherapy experience. He's presented at numerous national and international scientific conferences over the past 25 years on topics such as making use of synchronicity in psychotherapy and the effectiveness of psychological therapy for anxiety, depression, and trauma reactions. So in this show, we explored synchronicity, what it is, how it can show up, what it could mean, and how you can experience more of it. Let's jump in. Hello, Chris. A huge welcome to the show.
Hi, Leanne. Good to be with you.
Oh, it's fabulous, fabulous. And I am so excited about this topic. I really am. It feels quite magical, the way it all came about. And I'm really, really excited to dive into this. I was saying before we started recording that we've never done an episode dedicated specifically to this topic. I mean, it's come up in various ways. As I was saying, I tend to find that people, the more open-minded they are, the more they delve into forms of, say, spirituality and magic, this idea of synchronicity kind of naturally seems to come with the territory, but we've never done an episode just on this topic. So I am so excited about that.
Terrific. It is an exciting topic. It does have a bit of magic about it, for sure.
Yeah, it really does. So would you just share how you've ended up so fascinated by it, so passionate about it, that you've actually got to the point of writing a book about? How did you arrive here?
Well, I suppose all the things that really move you the most come back to personal experience. But it wasn't really a natural topic for me to look at initially, because I started off as a very rational-minded psychologist. I was trained in scientific method. I thought that if people believed in any kind of God or spirit, I thought it was just superstition, really. I was an atheist when I started working as a clinical psychologist in the early 80s. And so it actually was a big change for me when I went to a workshop one day called a wellness workshop by a fellow called John Travis from Johns Hopkins University in America. And he was talking about different kind of spiritual concepts in a way that bothered me with this wellness model. I like the optimism of looking at the positive pole of health, but it started to get a bit spiritual for my liking, all the worse because he's wearing a caftan at the time. And I thought, what credible person. Well, why don't the adults here speak up and say this is ridiculous? But at the end of his presentation, he said, look, I know you're skeptical about some of the things that I've raised here, but you might be interested to know that many scientists, including many physicists, are turning more to religion because they find that some of the concepts and principles of quantum physics overlap with spirituality in certain ways. And I was surprised by that. And I thought, well, I was curious enough to think I have to look this up a bit. And I read the book he recommended called The Aquarian Conspiracy that came out in the early 80s. And about 60 pages in or so, it had a section on synchronicity. And I started to experience an explosion of synchronicity that turned my world upside down. My housemates started to experience synchronicity. Like they'd say, my friend Ian said, I go to ring someone and they ring me at that exact second when I'm about to ring them. It might be someone I haven't spoken to for weeks or months. And I thought, something's happening here. And so my experiences compounded in different ways. And then I found some of those experiences to be quite meaningful. And it's become a guiding principle in my life, even though I wouldn't have talked about it so much with clients until recent years, because now I think there's a framework where we can talk about synchronicity, which is consistent with psychological science and wellbeing.
Oh, wow. I love that. So it sounds as though it wasn't so much a kind of logical understanding of, there is a thing called synchronicity and this could be worth it. It was just like you were like thrust into the experience of it itself, which there probably isn't a more compelling way to be taken onto a path. I love that.
And say in psychology, to me, it came back to probability. We're trained in probability and we accept a hypothesis as being true in our experiments if the finding is less than 1 in 20 chance of achieving that finding by chance alone. And so I thought some of the odds of these other things they seem like 1,000,000 to 1. For example, one day I saw 6 clients and all 6 clients spontaneously reported remarkable coincidences to me. Like one example, there was a client who is quite isolated, a young woman, and I asked her if she'd ever heard the expression, "No man is an island." And she came back the following week and she said, "This is really strange. My mother's just started this writing course. She was given this assignment. She didn't know how to do it. So she asked me to write this essay for her. No man is an island." 6 out of 6 people in one day had examples of around about that order. And I thought, there's something else going on here. My logical mind tells me there's something else happening.
Oh, I love that. Wow. Yeah. It was like, whether we call it God, the universe, someone wanted you to take a good look at this by the sounds of things. I love that. So I guess I feel like I want to ask you, where do you think would be helpful for us to journey next? You mentioned this idea of you've got to the point of actually seeing there is almost like a framework to synchronicity, and also how this links to, I guess you could say, well-being. Would you mind perhaps starting there, like sharing a bit about what you've seen about how this could be seen as a framework?
Sure, and I'll relate it to principles of positive psychology, which come back to a science of well-being. But if we think, first of all, of examples of synchronicity, it can be seeing certain numbers in an uncanny way. For many people, it starts off with seeing, for example, 11:11 on a clock. It can also be amazingly fortuitous coincidences. For example, someone decides to shift their career direction and they suddenly meet someone in very uncanny circumstances, unlikely circumstances, who can open a door to them to progress what they do in that area. Or it can just be a striking coincidence of whatever sort. One of the more common examples is when you think of someone you haven't seen for years and then they call you out of the blue the next day and you think, there's something else happening here. So there seem to be these examples of connections, if you like. That's that example. You think of someone and then they contact you, or you run into them overseas in unlikely circumstances. We call that propinquity. And it gives you a sense of connection to other people, as though there's more that connects us than meets the eye. I think another example of synchronicity is the fortuitous aspect. It's the notion of the universe provides. And it gives us the sense of some kind of higher organising force in the universe. But how many people experience it as well is like a life-affirming kind of direction. Often people experience more synchronicity when they feel that they're on the right track in the path they're going. So I refer to synchronicity in my experience as being like a tick from the universe that you're on the right track. And for me, for example, the repeated number 6 comes up a lot. And so the 6th of June always to me was a fortuitous date before I even learnt that that was the day that Carl Jung died, the afternoon of 6th of June. But for example, after I was dating my wife, my future wife, we experienced an extraordinarily large number of number sixes repeated. So when we'd stay in a hotel, often it would be the 6th room on the 6th floor, like room 66 or 606. It happened so uncannily often. And to relate it to a broader theme in life, in terms of life path or destiny, so we happened to get engaged. I wasn't, funnily enough, planning it like this, but it turned out to be at 6 o'clock on the 6th of June, the 6th month. Now, that was very auspicious, that time. In retrospect, when I realised when we got engaged, it felt like our relationship was meant to be. But 6 years later, partly as a result of very difficult hospital politics, I was admitted to a psychiatric hospital with severe depression at 6 o'clock on the 6th of June. Now, that's not the kind of thing that you consciously plan. I wasn't well oriented to time and that. But there was something that in retrospect seemed auspicious about that. And so whereas I felt that our relationship was partly meant to be by the way that the numbers, partly from the synchronicity, many other examples of it, but also I felt that there might be some good or purpose or meaning that came from my experience of depression. And some of the most useful learning that I went through was through that. So in terms of connections, a sense of an affirming life path, a sense of there being a transpersonal dimension in life that also could be provident, could provide for us and also provide meaning. Now, these kind of experiences tap into principles of positive psychology, because positive psychology says that anything that enhances one of 5 pillars of well-being will help our happiness overall and well-being. The 5 pillars are a PERMA model, P-E-R-M-A. There's positive affect, engagement in life roles, there's relationships or connections, meaning, and achievement. Now, from the examples I've given as well, where there can be an uplifting feeling, often people feel a sense of joy, or there might be a funny, quirky aspect, or even a sense of awe or curiosity. There's the positive affect that comes with synchronicity. Engagement in life roles. When people feel that their work is a calling or their relationship is meant to be, it helps your engagement in those roles. And so remarkable coincidences can be a way that adds to that engagement. That helps you be more resilient and face stress better and get more joy from your work. It also adds to the sense of meaning. It's motivating, so it helps lead to achievement. And then I mentioned relationships, the extra connection you feel with people when you have uncanny coincidences, or it might mark the development of your partnership or business partnership or relationship. So in terms of that PERMA model, synchronicity often supplies in spades to enhance those areas. And so I think that's where demonstrably, where we also know in psychology, if people believe in a spiritual dimension in life that adds to a sense of faith or hope, that's good for your well-being as well. So even if people aren't religious, even if we look at it from a secular point of view, synchronicity is a window into that dimension in life.
Oh, wow. I really, really love this. I particularly felt the a real resonance with what you're talking about when you got admitted to hospital with depression, and seeing the synchronicity of our date and time allowed you to experience that in a deeper, more meaningful way. And I see that over and over again with both my own life, but also the work that I do with people, where sometimes it's languaged as that kind of the descent or the dark night of the soul. And I think having that context, that wider context of this isn't just a random cruel thing that's happening to me. This is part of a story, part of a journey. For example, the Heroine's Journey by, is it Maureen Murdoch? It is Maureen Murdoch, isn't it? It just feels like, is it Maureen Murdoch or My goodness, my brain's gone for the moment. I quote it all
But
the time.
a wonderful archetypal story.
Yes. And is it Maureen Murdoch or Marion Woodman? My brain's gone. Maureen Murdoch. I knew I was saying the wrong name, so it's Maureen Murdoch. And I've quoted that book so many times. It's so funny how things just go out of your mind. And as you go round, there's a part of that story, that journey, that is the descent. It is that kind of often a bereavement, a depression, a big kind of life rupture. And I think having that sense of this is meant to be, there's meaning in here, there's a gift in here, helps what can be, a very, very difficult time in the life to be held in a way that has gifts. And I love the way that you're saying, to even see there was a kind of synchronicity to that allowed you to hold it in this context of this has rich meaning. This has a gift for me. It's not about bypassing the fact that it's, could be seen as, very difficult, painful, hellish, but it's held within this kind of bigger context of, and there is a bigger meaning behind this. I think that's such a great example. I've never heard synchronicity linked to that in such a clear way, but I really can see how that's helpful.
And then those stories about something that turns out it seems good, and then it turns out, no, actually that was a bad thing to happen. Then you think, oh, it's terrible. And then it turns out that there's some benefit from that. So actually it was good. So I found that traveling many years ago, you'd have these experiences and you think, oh, it's good, it's good. No, it's bad, it's bad. It's good, it's good. The fortunes could turn. And that was part of life experience. And I think of it now a little bit like an expression that my grandmother used. And she said that life is like a jigsaw puzzle. The older you get, the more you see the jigsaw puzzle pieces fall into place. And so there's a little bit less of that getting caught up in whether something must be good or bad at the time. But if it's meaningful, if we get more of a sense that there is some kind of direction, life path, whether we call it destiny, in work or other areas that can relate to calling, or any other way where we feel something is meant to be or there's some kind of organising force, that these things all give us a sense of hope or faith or heart. It helps deal with the darker times because, well, the longer most of us live, you do have experiences that are very challenging and you learn more about what you can come through and the people around you can come through. So as a psychologist, we see people who are typically coming in depressed and struggling, and we just see it as a stage that they're coming in. They're coming in at the stage of the dark night of the soul. And part of our work is looking to help those people, but we witness them coming through that. So our work is often uplifting. We see people start in the dark night of the soul, but you see people in all sorts of ways come through that, and the resilience, the learning that they develop from that. Most people do get a sense of meaning from coming through, say, an experience of depression and come out of it in some ways having learnt more, a little bit more fully developed of where they were in the first place.
Yeah. Yes, very much so. I love what you said, which is kind of linked to this, the way that the more that we get that sense of being on our path, feeling in alignment with our soul, you could say. We've talked about how that can show up in the difficult times, but I think you also were saying that seems to be the case, even what you could call the good times, the fact when we're not in the dark night of the soul and everything just feels like it's lining up magically. That's definitely been my experience, where it's like, I love the way you say it's almost like a tick from the universe. It's like this confirmation of like, yes, this is the right thing. And here's the confirmation. Here's the confirmation. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about that, because that definitely does seem, beyond coincidence when we see the ways that things line up so synchronistically when we're on our path.
Yes, and like you're describing, I find it often with a very positive experience. And one of the striking examples of that, it takes me back to when I wanted to acknowledge, having worked in Geelong for 25 years, I thought, how will I mark and celebrate a quarter century working as a psychologist in Geelong? And I thought, okay, I'll do a 1 hour talk, 1 hour free talk to the general public, and I'll try and sum up the most useful things I've learned in 25 years of psychology. I spent 10 minutes talking about Carl Jung and synchronicity. and this was one of the first times that I came out, if you like, in public, is believing in this mystical concept. I spent 20 minutes talking about Martin Seligman and the emerging field of positive psychology, which then in 2005 was a new field, and I thought people were going to be still talking about that in 100 years' time. And there's not much that I come across in psychology that I have that sense of. Now, 1 year later, I learned that Martin Seligman from Pennsylvania, who was one of the most prominent psychologists, not just in America, but in the world, was coming with his team to live in Geelong, a town of 200,000 people, 1 hour from Melbourne, across the other side of the world, with his team to be here for 2 years to start the world's largest project ever in positive psychology, doing a whole organisation-wide intervention, which they chose Geelong Grammar to do that because they knew it would have some world attention, partly because Prince Charles had gone there, but also it was away from the negative energy of the Iraq War that was happening around that time. And so they wanted a distant place where they had control over an environment. Now, so there's me talking about Jung and Seligman. The next year I'm meeting Seligman and his whole entourage. I became friends with the fellow who brought him over. I meet all of Seligman's team at barbecues and informally, and you wouldn't possibly hope to get a window into this group like that if you lived in Pennsylvania, let alone the other side of the world. And I thought, well, there it is. I call that experience a free kick from the universe, to use a sporting analogy.
Yeah.
Things happen and you're given a free kick. And I thought, well, that confirmed for me that I would keep on working the rest of my career in the field of incorporating positive psychology. But my particular bent with that is highlighting synchronicity as a way of getting at a transpersonal or spiritual or mystical dimension, which is often shunned in scientific fields. But I noticed the last few years, Seligman started to talk more about some of his, you could say, more mystical beliefs in certain ways, much more accepting of spiritual beliefs, and that's coming into that whole field.
Oh, wow. What an amazing free kick. I love that. What would you say, and I'm sure you have heard people ask you things like this, people who say that it's all just coincidence, probability is going to mean that sometimes improbable things happen, if that makes sense. Like looking at them in isolation, it looks very improbable, but across the board,
yes,
you're going to have improbable things happen just because of the nature of probability, and they're just coincidences. I'm sure you have been asked things like that before. What's your reply to that?
Well, I think that some things are just so uncanny, it's hard to dismiss them as just chance. And I'll give one example. On the day I started writing the second edition of my book, The Positive Psychology of Synchronicity, so I'm sitting down to write the second day. Funnily enough, I had 3 phone calls that day, which I tend to get 3 phone calls in a year about this, but 3 phone calls, very different people with striking examples of synchronicity. One was an email, 2 are phone calls. This email came through from a fellow who said, look, I've read your book, the first edition, this was on synchronicity. No one knew I was writing anything again particularly, so it was very uncanny timing. But he said, look, I want to tell you this story about a psychic monk. He said, many years ago, I was driving to this monastery where I used to spend some weekends studying up on history books and things like that. There was an amazing story behind how he found this monastery. It was synchronistic. But anyway, he went to this monastery and he took a friend with him. And he said to the friend, it was actually around the time of the Melbourne Cup weekend, a famous horse race in Melbourne. And he said to the friend, look, I believe that at this convent that we're visiting, that there's a psychic monk. And they got into this funny little chat, and the friend said, well, how would you know that a monk is psychic? And he said, well, maybe if we see him rocking back and forth on a wooden rocking horse, then we'll say that monk is psychic. And they laughed. It was just, what a ridiculous thing to say.
It was just whole, like a joke. Like yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Just ridiculous thing. They get to the abbey later in the evening, knock on the door, and there are about 25 monks there. Now, the person who answered happened to be the person who's meant to be this psychic monk. So that was the first thing that was a little bit uncanny. Anyway, they sit down by a fire, and it's a bit awkward because this monk's just sitting there saying nothing. these two guys sitting on either side of him. Now, they thought, well, how do they break the silence? So one of them said to the monk, can you tell us how you see the meaning of God? And the monk said, well, it's like this. He was sitting on a wooden chair and he started moving back and forth. Slightly started moving more. After a while, he started moving wildly back and forth and pretended he got a horsewhip and started to whip like this. God is like a rider on a horse, and sometimes he lets the reins go a little bit more. Now, I thought that was remarkable because I thought that Freud talked about the psyche as being like a rider on the horse. Mm. This person talked about God as being like a rider on a horse. Now, later on, through remarkably synchronistic experiences, I came across writings of Plato and Phaedrus where he described the soul as the rider on a winged horse or a winged chariot. I thought, this is interesting because I'm trying to make the connection between psychology and spirituality. And so psychology, like Freud and the psyche rider on a horse, and Plato describes it like the soul is a rider on a winged horse. And I think what a beautiful kind of description. But I think that when you think that something like this, like the person getting in touch with me, I thought there's something in this about a rider on a horse. Subsequently, there are half a dozen different things I came across that are too complicated to describe now. But it led me on to look up more of Plato and to see there's a story in this, because psychology is meant to be the study of the soul. And psychiatry technically means soul doctoring, but there's not much soul in psychology, how it's taught. There's not much soul in psychiatry. So these kinds of little riddles and things that happen, I find very energizing to think it's so much beyond chance, just random chance. So what might be the meaning? And you find some of the meaning, like I think that if we think of the soul as being like the rider on a winged horse, I think that's an example also how we can use some of the psychic ability that sometimes comes up with synchronicity. For example, I have a friend I refer to as my mentor, Ross, and he taught me a lot about synchronicity, a very wise fellow. But he also used that experience to tap into his intuition further. So one time he needed his aunt in Melbourne to sign some papers to sell a house, and he only had one day to be able to get these papers signed. It might have been to purchase a house. But he needed these papers signed. He'd been ringing her for days in Melbourne, and he thought, I can't get her on the phone. I'm going to have to drive to her house. Miles before her house, he got the sense to take a sudden left. He drove about another mile or two in a different direction to where he'd normally travel, saw his aunt on the other side of the road, got out, asked her to sign the papers for him. She said, what on earth are you doing here? I never come here. He said, I came to ask you to sign these papers. It's so amazing, this fellow's experience, because he's so open to his intuition and he's tapped into this. Now, I think that that's an example of, if you like, the soul at work. That's kind of that's when Seligman talks about prospection or seeing ahead as being a unique human quality. I think that's like a kind of uncanny prospection. It's like the difference between having a horse with wings compared to riding a horse, like the extra potential, human potential, the extra human potential that could come from if we're open to this, I think is remarkable. Even how placebo works, placebo effects work in our mind. It's wondrous how the human body can work when we use our imagination in certain ways as well. So I suppose
Can I just stop you there for a moment? Because there's so many wonderful things you're saying, and I don't want to lose some of the bits that I'd love to just ask you a deeper question on before we move on. But this is just wonderful. What you were just saying there about intuition and how that can be linked to synchronicity, it brought to mind one of my favourite books, Original Wisdom, which is about, I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's based on indigenous band of people, tribe of people living in Malaysia, I think it is, and a researcher that kind of over the years sort of goes and gets to know them, befriends them, studies them. And the particular thing that came to mind was they lived kind of deep in, I guess, the jungle. And he would land wherever he was going to land on a plane and then kind of go into the jungle and have to go and find them. And every time he would be met close to the entrance by one of the people from this band. And he had no means of contact. They wouldn't know that he was coming. It was, miles away from where they actually were staying. And when he would try and ask, like, how did you know I was coming? How did you know to come to this path in the middle of a jungle at this time to meet me? And it was, they didn't always have the world they lived in, the way they saw the world was so steeped in this the winged horse way of being in the world. Yes. I think it was almost like the impression he got that they couldn't even like answer it in a way that could make sense to him, because it just was their worldview of course, if I have this sense to come into this path at this time of the day, I'm going to follow it, aren't I? And then it turns out it's to meet you, was kind of roughly what they would say. And I really see over and over again that's true for us. The more wild we are, the more in contact with our soul we are, that's actually just part of us being human. It's only because we've become so conditioned out of that way of being. It feels magical and almost like that isn't normal. But I actually wonder whether like that is actually of humans. The more wild we are, the more we're kind of living in that winged horse way. Like, of course, that's just how it works.
I think that's a great way of putting it. And I've heard many Aboriginal stories describing exactly the same thing. And when the person encounters someone else and they're not using clocks or calendars to meet up with them, they act like it's the most natural thing in the world. It's not like they act that surprised, just like my friend when he met with his aunt. And some of this, it reminds me of a famous American psychologist, William James, who wrote a lot about mystical phenomena. And so he was seen as being quite unconventional, but was greatly respected. He's quoted often now in positive psychology circles. But a number of people thought that he must be a bit of a rat bag because he talked of mystical phenomena, wrote about a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, and very meaningful kind of work. But interestingly, even though he was often dismissed by other academics at the time, as well as he was revered by a number as well, but it was often dismissed. But he started the first psychological laboratory. He was a very scientifically minded person. And that also reminded me how Carl Jung only wrote about synchronicity when he was encouraged to do so by Wolfgang Pauli, who was one of the handful of fathers of quantum physics. And Pauli, who'd been a client of Jung's, said to Jung, I know that you're very interested in synchronicity. I know you're wary about writing about it. If you write about synchronicity, I will write a chapter in a monograph with you, because this is worth getting this message out to the wider world. And it turned out that many of the pioneers of quantum physics, like Schrödinger and Heisenberg, they had some quite mystical beliefs, because after they looked at the findings from quantum physics, then they realized that a lot of very similar concepts had come up in, for example, Vedanta scripts in religion. And so there's something closer between science and religion than we often think, because we're often taught not to think like that. And as William James said, some of the training in universities, he wrote this 100 years ago, is antithetical to learning more about the reality of life in some ways.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So how would you, maybe this is a bit of a cruel question, but you've talked about things like quantum physics and how that can be seen very much as a basis for understanding, I guess the more sort of traditionally would see this as more spirituality, and then looking at it through the lens of quantum physics, it's like, these aren't quite so different. Actually, they could be interchangeable or certainly overlaid. How would you word like what's going on beneath the hood? Like when we see these synchronicities happen in our lives, what do you think's kind of underneath that? What's making that happen? What is that kind of web of life that's creating those connections?
Okay, now I think that there's a principle of entanglement that's helpful, but I will mention something at first. The first time I looked to write a chapter on quantum physics, so I took 6 months reading books to try and get my head around it because it was such a complex thing. But then I sat down to write this chapter, and on the main day that I started writing about that, again I got distracted by emails, and I think I was procrastinating. And one of them, I'd never come across an email from a physicist like this, but it had this expression: if you think that you understand quantum physics, then you don't. And I think that might have been Richard Feynman, but funny enough, that was very synchronistic. And I thought, well, I might be an imposter writing about this, but that gives me license to write more. But I think the principle of entanglement is a wondrous notion. So this is something that was proved in the 1960s and 70s. It was based on a hypothesis from Einstein. But funnily enough, Einstein predicted that entanglement wouldn't be true. He said that if quantum physics is true, and there's a lot of it that I don't really accept as it's written, then that would mean that there could be spooky action at a distance, meaning you get two bits of matter connected instantaneously at a distance rather than having to travel at the speed of light to get from one to the other. They'd be instantly connected. Now, I don't know how they could possibly prove this, but they did in scientific terms. In the 60s and 70s, they showed that if you had, for example, two particles or two electrons in contact with each other, and then you could separate them at very great distances, technically from one side of the universe to the other, then if something affected the spin of one electron, it was measured that instantaneously the twinned electron would spin in a complementary manner. Now, this demonstrated that matter could be instantaneously connected at a distance. Now, I think if matter could be instantaneously connected at a distance, why not people's minds? And why can't there be a connection between what happens in someone's mind and some kind of matter? Because as Schrödinger said, and there's ways of demonstrating this, that all matter basically comes down to consciousness. It's a hard concept to consider. But if everything started off with a Big Bang, then everything was in contact with each other in the first place.
Yes.
So if this principle of entanglement is true, then everything's entangled. Everything's connected with everything else in ways that we can't really comprehend with our three-dimensional brains. We can't comprehend exactly quite what that means. But these, in other words, you do get spooky action at a distance. And I think that's what we hear when we hear, for example, an identical twin. They contact their twin because they've had like a sore knee or a pain in their chest, and they find out that their twin has had like a knee injury or a heart attack at just that time. You hear of those stories and you think, well, how could that be true? Well, I don't know how entanglement's true, but it is, and it seems to be a parallel kind of concept.
Oh, I love the way you talked about that. I think that's it's like you say, there's a point at which we can see so much, and then there's a point at which like our minds just aren't equipped for the job. It's just like, okay, I'm going to accept it kind of works like this. And there's probably, it may be at some point we grow in consciousness enough to really understand it. But I love that. Thank you. So one final question before we finish. For someone who's listening to this and thinking, I'd love some more of that in my life, what would you suggest would be a way of, I guess, having more synchronicity, seeing more synchronicity in their life? What would you suggest to them?
I think the first thing is to be open. Like if we're open, at least we can maybe notice some things that we can't just explain in rational terms. So I think that's the very first thing, because many people do experience this other dimension in life, and certainly every culture in the world has its shamans and indigenous cultures which often relate to this more. So we can probably do with a little bit more intuition in our life than rationality for balance. So first of all, be open. Secondly, notice what you notice. If something stands out as like uncanny or odd, or it intrigues us, rather than just dismissing it as, oh, no, I can't explain that rationally, just let it sit there a little bit. We might not get any sense of what it might mean at first, but as my mentor, Ross, describes, file it away. Put it in the back of your mind, because later on, it might become more meaningful. And look, for example, the rider on the horse analogy, for the other things that I've learned since that make sense of that. So you file it away, later on letting it become more meaningful. So I think that also if people do notice something like that, I think it can be good to tell someone. Certainly even write it down. Just like if we write down our dreams, we'll tend to experience and remember more dreams just from paying attention to it. But I think that there is a benefit in saying to someone else, like a trusted friend, or it could be an acquaintance, it could be anybody. I think when people talk more about these kind of experiences, we're giving more license to what about half the population believes in anyway. And so I think that helps go beyond what I call ultra-rational or rationalistic thinking, and have more scope to develop what I call supra-rational thinking, not irrational and less than rational. Sometimes our intuition, like my friend finding his aunt, or people finding each other again when we think that's against the odds, they haven't used their watch or something to find them. Being open to develop that side of our experience. So there is a transpersonal dimension that many people relate to. What we know from the science of well-being and people's physical and mental health, when people do believe in a spiritual or transpersonal dimension in life, it actually tends to be good for your health. It tends to promote hope. It tends to help have faith. It adds to our sense of awe and wonder and curiosity. So I think that the main thing is be open, notice, maybe acknowledge to other people. But I'm a psychologist, so what I say to people in everyday life when they're dealing with anxiety or depression or whatever as well is go by your experience, but test your ideas. But being open to testing our rationalistic ideas as well as, it's fine to be skeptical, but I think just allowing some scope for something to resonate with us a different way. And if we do notice that, just let it sit there for a while rather than dismiss it too readily.
Oh, I really, really love everything you suggested there. And I think there is definitely, just as you say, being open to see, you're likely to see more, because I'm sure there's things that happen that could be considered synchronistic that people just miss. They're just so in that tunnel vision, not open to see more, and they just don't see them. So I'm sure just being open to see them means you'll see them. But you're so right. I mean, I'm in the practice quite often of writing down my dreams, and you're completely right. The more I do so, the more I remember, but also the more meaning they have. The more times I'm like, wow, that really now makes sense. I dreamed that because it relates to this, or gave me an answer for this. And sometimes to an extent that's been beyond anything I've expected. I've ended up with whole, it's hard to even explain, but like a whole method of how to do something has come from a little thread that I pulled from a dream that I'd had that night. It has blown me away, just that one thing. So I love that. Honestly, I could continue talking to you about this on the topic for so much longer, but we do need to wrap up. If people would like to know more about you and your work and your book, where best to find all of that?
Okay, so first of all, in terms of the book, the website synchronicityunwrapped.com.au. So AU for Australia, of course. And our main practice website is Chris Mackey, mackey.com.au. We have lots of resources, including mental health resources there. One of the things is a podcast that I do with my son. It's called Psych, Spiels and Silver Linings. So it's about positive psychology applied to psychological topics like anxiety, depression, dealing with trauma, being more motivated, dealing with burnout, positive aspects as well. Actually, the next couple of weeks we'll be doing a couple on synchronicity as well. So Psych, Spiels and Silver Linings for a podcast, chrismackey.com.au, or for the book, it's synchronicityunwrapped.com.au. I add blogs on that from time to time, new writing and blogs.
Wonderful. I'm messing around with the mute button there. Wonderful. I'll make sure they're all going to be on the show notes too. So if people are struggling to make a note of that, go to the show notes and all of those will be there. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much, Chris.
Well, thank you so much, Leanne. I've really enjoyed it.
I loved that. Here are my best bits. We seem to see more synchronicities the more we're on our path. And that's really been my own experience of synchronicities and also that of the clients I've worked with. Very much does seem that way. I love how Chris described humans as not being confined to these physical bodies. We can fly, as per Einstein's quote, spooky action at a distance. Be open and you will see more. Notice what you notice. Pay attention. For example, write down your dreams, talk to others about synchronicity and follow your intuition. If you'd like to get the notes and links, and there's quite a lot for everything we spoke about this week, hop on over to the show notes and they're at primalhappiness.co/episode 305. And if you don't want to miss out on the next episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, or your Android or iOS app of choice and hit that subscribe button. That way you'll get each episode delivered auto-magically as soon as it comes out. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you next year.